Shali, should we kick it off?
Yes, I think I'm just taking a look. There are a few people. If we want to wait a few minutes to see if more people join, your call. I think there are three, four
I mean,
people who have joined.
I think we should just start because just stick to our time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I hope everybody agrees with that, right? So okay, so I'm just going to kick it off. Welcome everybody, the kind of panelists and also a few others who've joined us on good relations in smart cities, the interplay between digitalization, governance, and urbanization. My name is Vikram Mathur. I'm an environmental scientist, urban planner, and also an anthropologist. And I run a small research collective based out of Goa in India. And this kind of panel comes out of some work that my colleague Ashali, who you have also interacted with and will be part of this session, and I are working on setting up what we are calling India's first urban living lab in the city of Panjim in Goa. And it's part of what we call a smart city efforts, and a lot of the kind of emphasis in this smart city kind of mission of the Indian government is on bringing digital technologies in various aspects of urban life, right? So our kind of interest in this topic emerges from working on these issues, and really we are interested in the question of examining how digitalization is changing power relations and issues of access and inequity, and the relationship between different actors in cities around the world. So that's in some sense how this panel came up, we got some really excellent abstracts, of which we were only able to select five. So we have five speakers today, and I'm just going to quickly mention what the papers are and what those and the speakers, introduce them in one line, and then we are going to move on to recorded presentation from the panelists. So we begin with Dr. Puyo Sefer who's a lecturer at the Department of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Vienna on coded jaywalkers and the performability of smart traffic lights. That's our first paper. The second paper from Dr. Justine Humphrey, Senior Lecturer in Digital Cultures in the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Sydney, and Dr. Chris Chesser, Senior Lecturer in Digital Cultures at the University of Sydney, on homelessness, spatial inequalities, and the datafication of urban space. The third paper is Where Are Smart Cities Made? Within, Beneath, Above, and Beyond the City. Dr. Torek Holmes, who's a research associate at the University of Manchester, and Dr. Rebecca Winmeyer, lecturer in environmental planning at the University of West England. And then we have our fourth paper, Smartening Ordinary Citizens, the narrative of Sejong Smart City residents in South Korea. And this paper is presented by Joel Champelet, doctoral candidate at the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy at the Korean Advanced Institute for Science and Technology. And then finally, we have a paper on body politics and the politics of technology, technological experience among street-based sex workers in Bangalore. And this paper is presented by Dr. Anand Kamath, who's an assistant professor at the School of Social Science, National Institute of Advanced Studies, and Dr. Neethi Padmanabhan, who's a senior consultant and academic at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. So these are the five papers that are being presented in this panel. And just very quickly, the structure is going to be, so my welcome and introduction is now almost done. And now we're going to screen the presentations, and my colleague Ashali, who's much more tech savvy, is going to screen the presentations, and then Ashali is also then going to come in, say little bit more about her work, but also kind of tease out some emerging themes across the presentations. And she has about 5-10 minutes to do that. And then we have kept a good chunk of about almost 40 minutes, I would say, 35 to 40 minutes on a kind of a moderated Q&A. I'll kick off the Q&A with some questions from myself. And then after the Q&A, we'll take another 4-5 minutes. And again, Ashali will come back to wrap up the session. So that's how we have structured it. I hope everybody is being able to navigate this mid space well. And I think with that, I just want to kind of hand over to Ashali to, screen the presentation, but also if you have any kind of technical instructions for the rest of the sessions, Ashali, please come in. And also maybe just introduce yourself already now.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Vikram. My name is Ashali. I'm a senior urban planner at Transitions Research, and I'm looking at how growing mid-sized cities in India are navigating urban transitions. So we can talk a little bit more about that later, but in terms of kind of the housekeeping rules for this session, if you're not speaking, I'd request you to please keep yourself on mute to avoid any kind of echo or audio disruption. For everybody watching, thank you for being here. You can use the chat box. For me, it's on the right-hand side of my screen. I hope it's on your right-hand side of the screen. And you can, type in your questions. I think there's a question button. So feel free to use that. And, we'll be compiling all those questions towards the end of the session and asking our panelists. You can direct them directly to panelists as well if you'd like. And lastly, we hope that, everything we're discussing today, any questions, all our work is in compliance with the 4S ethics policy. So with that, I'd like to get started. I'll share my screen and show the first pre-recorded video. I hope this works. Okay. All right. And so I'm hoping you can see this. I'm going to make it full screen and play. And if you can't hear or are there any issues, please let me know in the chat.
My presentation is an investigation of how algorithmic practices come into effect in everyday life. I particularly follow the design process of smart pedestrian traffic lights in Vienna, where we're employing algorithmic practices in a seemingly mundane urban artifact raises wider inquiries into the means and ends of smartification. We live in an algorithmic society. This statement draws our attention to the ways in which algorithms are increasingly present in our lives. So far, studies have problematized algorithms in the society, especially in controversial cases of policing, migration, evaluation, or in the courts. While challenges intact, algorithms remain a fascinating sites of observing social order and control. My research, though, takes a rather different path. I aim to study algorithms in everyday life where they become most invisible and least controversial. Applying a material semiotics approach, I explore how algorithmic practices are employed to reinscribe the idea of good behavior thanks to the new capacities provided by digital smart infrastructures. In doing so, I find nowhere better than cities. I have to mention that I've been studying smart city programming in Vienna, where I analyze the historically rooted narrative making in re-infrastructuring the city into a smart future, despite the smart city imagining as a global phenomenon. In this slide, I kept asking where I could trace algorithmic practices that matter in everyday life of Vienna. Let me bring this question into city context first. Over a century ago, Patrick Geddes stated that a city is more than a place in space. It is a drama in time. Fixed in space, but they constantly change in time. Bringing time and change into account, Manuel Castells has defined contemporary cities as being a space of flows, thus linking place and space with the activities that compose them. And since the digital 10, cities have become a new science, as Michael Bathy argues. Against such a background, I step outside the department's building to seek to find algorithmic practices. My work being informed by Henry Lefebvre and Shintaro Miyazaki, who creatively combines algorithms to describe how the time-ordered movements are measured and how it matters in everyday life. To the first junction, I soon encountered what I was seeking for. While standing behind a traffic light, I suddenly find an everyday object of urban rhythmic ordering, as well as an object of study. Traffic lights, as one of the most successful inventions of the 20th century, in which they managed to become a universal artifact in traffic management. However, they have their own limitations due to the way they grant priority to different means of mobility. This issue is particularly a source of disruption when it comes to the crossings where pedestrians must use a push-button light. In Vienna, there are more than 200 of those, which, according to the authorities, they lead to confusion and unnecessary waiting time for cars and pedestrians on a road. Here, smart traffic lights enter with the promise of more convenience and less waiting time. This system was designed using smart camera systems that recognizes pedestrians' intent to cross the road and changes automatically to green, resulting to better flow of traffic. However, it sounds simple and useful, but in the design process, the visually impaired people were not included as users, and it led to redesign of the system, which I want to reflect on and close my presentation with. Throughout my investigation, I tried to understand how the decisions were made and how the experts imagined the premises that should be included in the design process and how they failed to consider the need of visually impaired people. So far, I only find a series of opaque and fragmented decisions with lack of meaningful relation between the issues at stake with the solution offered. In short, the process lacks any form of engagement with the public and is truly an ad hoc experiment. This rather simple example shows us how smart initiatives offer a moment of reflection on the ways in which the city frames issues and solutions with priorities given to specific actors and not others. Here, the question arises with regard to mobility justice and techno-democracy, where I will further examine the meanings embedded in the way traffic lights perform social order. Thanks for your attention.
And there are no issues. Yeah, I will move on to the next presentation. Sorry, I'm just seeing a note from Ed. And people will get better quality if I just play the pre-recorded video. I can try that and see if that works. Hold on. Sorry, everyone, for the difficulties.
Actually, for me, that doesn't work. I can't see that.
You couldn't see that one. So
Yeah,
it only worked if I shared my screen?
Yeah, this is working fine. So
Okay, then I'll stick to that for now.
let's stick to that, please.
Oh, the presenter would like to put in a video. Okay, hold on. Okay.
Hi, my name is Justine Humphrey and I'm a senior lecturer in digital cultures at the University of Sydney. In this video, I'm giving a brief summary of the paper I'm presenting on homelessness, spatial inequalities, and the datafication of urban space on behalf of myself and Chris Cheshire. This paper draws on my research of Link NYC, a network of Wi-Fi enabled kiosks in New York City. And I situate this within literature on critical data studies, digital inclusion, and public space. The key issue I examine is the relationship between public connectivity and data extraction, with attention to the way that smart urban platforms embed data asymmetries that create new or additional data risks and harms for people who are homeless and marginalized, while at the same time promising to provide digital inclusion benefits to these same groups. Critical data studies is forging new ground in identifying a wide range of issues that emerge with datafication. These authors have shown that asymmetries of data lead to further discrimination and reinforce disadvantage. While there's been a lot of emphasis on bias, one area of data asymmetries less well examined is the connection between asymmetries of data and digital access. This becomes particularly pertinent when contextualizing data within the spaces and places of digital use. Data asymmetries can play out at the point of exchange and connection, and around the connection itself. In 2018, I conducted a new study of Link NYC with the aim to understand their digital inclusion outcomes in the context of their association with smart cities. The Smart Publics project that I co-led the following year was an international collaboration between two universities with a large multidisciplinary team. I'm going to concentrate on the first study. Smart kiosks are often aligned with smart cities, a term that originates in a notion that the real-time data generated from urban sensing devices can be used for improving city services and planning. Link NYC is the main product of Intersection, a US firm with investment from Sidewalk Labs, the urban innovation arm of Google's holding company, Alphabet. The company brands itself as a smart cities technology and media company. The kiosks, called Links, provide a suite of services: free Wi-Fi, phone calls, USB charging, a red emergency button, and a range of mapping and directory services through an inbuilt terminal. But it's the data capabilities of this object that distinguishes it from previous technological forms that might offer similar access services. The use of Links by New York's homeless has been widely reported, particularly around its early rollout in 2016. My own research confirmed that visibly street homeless appear to use the kiosks more than other groups. Those I spoke to said that the Links help them to get access to services and feel safe, especially at night. Many came with their own mobiles, while some relied on it as their only form of communication. Young people were another noticeable group that used the Links, and for very similar reasons: to check in and to let others know they were safe and all right. In our Smart Publics project, we found a similar profile of users, but we also observed that gig workers were another key user group. This is where we come to the connectivity data extraction exchange, which sums up the way that free connectivity services are used as the basis for enrolling users into systems where they become subject to new data practices that they may or may not be aware of and have little control over. The asymmetry of the connection encompasses legal, technical, commercial, spatial, and policing dimensions, and it can result in significant harm to marginalized and disadvantaged groups in city and public spaces in particular. So, who is most affected by the connectivity data extraction exchange? Poor people, street homeless, young people, communities of colour and precarious workers, all over-policed populations who face potential consequences of data harms through their use of these services, even when these technologies play a critical safety role. While data threats seem low in the list of existential harms, it's the compounding effects of these and the way that they interact with existing forms of disadvantage that makes them so concerning. So, some concluding thoughts. The connectivity data extraction exchange reveals the ways that smart urban technologies can be the basis of new kinds of harms for traditionally excluded groups. And while there may be steps that we can take to mitigate against these harms, there is a broader question of whether it's ethical and just to provide essential digital services premised on data extraction. A key goal, therefore, for cultivating good relations in smart cities is to account for and address situated data relations and connection asymmetries, and to tackle these alongside the unequal geographies of power in urban space. Thank you.
Gonna move to the next one.
Peter. Ready when you are.
Thank you, Rebecca. So hi everyone out there, my name's Torek Holmes. You just heard from Rebecca there. She's one of my co-authors for this chapter we've written, and also with Carla, our contact information is there. So the title of the chapter we've written is Where Are Smart Sustainable Cities Made? Tracing Wired Socio-Technical Relationships in, Through, Beneath and Beyond a City. And we'll give you a bit of a better idea of why we've come up with that question and the sort of approach we've taken. The chapter's been written for a forthcoming book called Smart Cities, Energy and Sustainability, Governing Cities to a Low Carbon Future. Next slide, please. So in terms of literature that's out there that we've been looking at, and actually why we raised the question that we do, there's a lot of work in sort of smart, sustainable cities, on smart city ideologies, sort of local policy initiatives, and the deployment of smart technological sort of innovations in context and in cities. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. However, all of this work that focuses on stuff that's going on in cities, it's all great and makes sense to do that, but our sort of interest in socio-technical systems and the nature of those systems has pushed us to think about actually what's going on these systems, how are sort of obligatory, or how do they form obligatory points of passage that sort of smart, sustainable ambitions sort of mediated through and calibrated in reference to. And specifically to think about along sort of obligatory points of passage, be these to do with energy networks, transport networks, digital networks. Where are the sort of hot areas on those networks, sort of places where sort of the constitution of the world is still being debated, and crucially in this instance, where smart and sustainable sort of futures are contested. And to do this, we take sort of an oligoptic approach, which involves sort of looking beyond what's going on in cities and then tracing connections out of cities. And when I say connections, we mean sort of very material connections along infrastructure networks. So they're the sort of key ideas that we're working with. And I've given you obviously an idea of the question we're asking. I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now to give a very brief explanation of sort of what we found, what we did, and sort of the implications of our work so far.
Thank you, Torek. So yeah, I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview of the 4 hot areas that we look at in the chapter. So building on the ideas that Torek introduced, we decided to focus on electricity and kind of clean energy. And this was because smart, sustainable cities depend on the provision of clean, renewable energy. So the 4 hot areas that we explore in the chapter are the City of Manchester, where we look at the kind of policy surrounding renewable energy and their sustainable, smart, sustainable ambitions. We then look at a smart and sustainable building that's in the centre of the city, and we look at what it takes to get those type of buildings connected to the electricity network and what that means for future smart city developments. From that building, we trace the wires out into the electricity network, where we look at a key piece of investment in infrastructure. And we then continue to follow the wires out to look at 2 wind farms, where we look at the policy and social challenges around renewable energy development. So just to provide a kind of brief overview of how we address these hot areas and our kind of speculative suggestions that have come from our chapter. Firstly, we suggest that local planning policies need to speed up the delivery of distributed generation. We then suggest a re-regulation of connection charges based on sustainability credentials rather than just network capacity. We also suggest that networks should predict and provide for the most sustainable futures, recognizing that the most sustainable futures is a concept that may change. And finally, we recommend city-based advocacy and support for renewable energy in rural areas. So finally, just to conclude with some of the kind of further questions that our chapter has led us to consider. It's led us to consider kind of what's happening at other sites. We are focusing on these 4 hot areas, but there's likely to be other areas with different actors and different responsibilities that may influence the future of smart, sustainable cities. And also, a key area that's emerged from this work is the multiple spatio-temporal dimensions of urban energy transitions. And this is something that Torik's written a little on recently. Thank you.
I'm going to move to our 4th presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joëlle Champalet, and I will present my work on different narratives of Sejong Smart City, which I conducted in the framework of my master's thesis. As I will illustrate later in this presentation, there are 2 smart city narratives in Sejong: the design smart city of the decision makers and the lived smart city of the residents. The gap between those 2 narratives questions the legitimacy of the smart label and what it means to live in a smart city. In this study, I'm mainly interested in the daily life and transformative impact of smart systems on citizens' behaviors. I argue that citizens' daily experiences offer a more in-depth and precise understanding of the efficiency of the smart city model and its actual impact in transforming citizens' practices towards more ecologically responsible behavior. This research questioned how do Sejong smart systems embedded in the territory of urban citizens impact daily life practices. I expected that the smart artifacts and services of Sejong would transform citizens' daily life behaviors, but that those behaviors do not correspond to the initial objectives envisioned by decision makers concerning the smart city. To answer these questions, my first step was to analyze urban planning documents, more specifically the implementation plan of the Sejong Smart City National Plan, which details the different smart city infrastructures recognized officially by decision makers. And I also used official Korean and English websites of the city of Sejong and the official National Korean Smart City portal. From there on, I conducted 10 semi-structured interviews with previous and current residents of Sejong. The questions were focused on specific aspects of daily lives that came out in the urban planning documents, such as mobility, recycling, access to information, and others. Then in the second part, I assessed their understanding of a smart city and their perception of the city of Sejong as a smart city. These 2 steps interviews confronted with my initial document analysis revealed different gaps in narratives and expected behavior versus practiced behavior that I will detail hereafter. I framed my research into data I collected using 3 main concepts: the environmental mode of governance and the physical and psychological appropriation of the smart city. Before going further, I will give a little bit of background information on the South Korean city of Sejong, special self-governing city. Sejong was an attempt to rebalance national development outside of the Seoul metropolitan area by transferring political and administrative functions outside of the capital. The city was officially inaugurated in 2012. Sejong was initially planned to be constructed under the ubiquitous eco-city model, and its circular design was accompanied by a decentralization of the main urban functions around the city. Smart artifacts recognized by decision makers are divided into 3 categories in urban planning documents: the urban infrastructure, the smart city infrastructure, and the civic participation and communication infrastructure. As I discovered, most of the artifacts present in these categories have had minimal impact on daily life behavior, with 2 exceptions: the transportation system and infrastructure, as well as the automatic clean-net system, which is the automatic garbage collection and recycling system that I will after that call ACNS. During my interviews, these two aspects of the smart city were the only one to come out. When asking for a description of their daily life, people would naturally speak about how they go to work and how movement inside of and outside of the city shaped their life with them, and how the ACNS became a staple of their new life in Sejong. Sejong's smart city, as envisioned by decision makers, correspond to the ubiquitous ecocity. The project focused mainly on a shift towards sustainable transportation and walkability, as well as energy consumption management and waste management. The initial ring-shaped design of the city and neighborhood development plan promotes a lifestyle centered inside of the neighborhood unit, organized around the public transportation stations. More technological artifacts and infrastructure reinforce the central position of transportation, as well as the role of big data management and analysis to coherently and efficiently coordinate the different flux and consumption of Sejong. Citizens are depicted as inhabitant as sensor, passively influenced and benefiting of the decision of the machine. For decision makers, the smart city is the current and the future model of development for the city of Sejong. In practice, though, this top-down influence of smart systems is hardly recognizable in the daily life of inhabitants. The appropriation of sustainable behavior concerning mobilities does not fully correspond to the initial hope of a complete shift towards sustainable transportation. Personal cars still occupy a major place in daily pendular mobilities toward neighboring towns, either for work or for leisure activities. Smart mobilities, as supported by decision makers, receive ambivalent acceptance from residents who can feel forced to evolve within the infrastructure at their disposition. On the other side, the waste management system, ACNS, is the only official smart systems of Sejong which was fully appropriated by citizens. Extremely visible in the landscape, it has also begun reflection on consumption and the use of non-recyclable items in the daily life of citizens. With the exception of the ACNS and the mobility infrastructure, other smart infrastructures and artifacts recognized by the decision makers do not appear in citizens' interview. There is an invisibility of these systems in residents' daily life perception. It is both a lack of visibility of the service and artifact in the physical landscape of the city, as well as a lack of understanding of what these artifacts can do. I think that this double invisibility of smart systems is one of the major obstacles when it comes to achieve some of the objectives of the smart city. On another side, the psychological appropriation of the concept of the smart city by Sejong's resident showed a definite inclination to understand the smart city as a patchwork, an assemblage of technological artifacts connected by data to create a functional and homogeneous object. In their eyes, citizens of a smart city also appears to be passive receptors of the advantages of the different smart systems. But when it comes to their perception of their own city, Sejong is first and foremost the place they live in. From the account of their daily life, their encounter with what they consider as technological smart artifacts are reduced to the ACNS and some part of the transportation system, such as signalization panels. Without the necessary visibility of the other smart infrastructures, as well as the geographically delimited living area, citizens cannot consider Sejong as a smart city. Instead, it is depicted as a new city in which some technological artifacts are considered as smart, but independent from one another. They do not consider Sejong as a smart city, but a new city still under development. The smart city is for them a future potential development of Sejong. As we can see, there is a difference in temporality between citizens and decision makers' psychological appropriation of Sejong as a smart city, and the physical appropriation of Sejong smart systems is either inexistent, not perceived, or not understood by citizens of Sejong. The difference between decision makers and citizens' perception of the smart city hinders the efficiency and durability of the smart city model. Giving more attention to citizens' experience allows to see another narrative of Sejong's self-governing city and its smartness. It also asks a question of the legitimacy of the label of smart city in the communication made by decision makers to attract residents through an incentive such as its smartness. If the current citizens do not consider Sejong as a smart city, can it be marketed as such? The study also brought forward the fact that there is a want from citizens to express their opinions, demands, and questions about the future of their city and its continuous development as a smart city, but that they lack a space of expression for the different views. Moreover, most of the expectation concerning the development of Sejong cannot be linked directly with the smart city objectives or enter directly into contradiction, such as the lack of parking spaces for cars or the need for more cultural and leisure activities development. As such, another question arises: is developing the smart systems a priority for Sejong urban development?
All right, and for our last presentation,
Hello everyone. This workers in Bangalore city is part of a much larger ethnographic work about urban transition and street-based sex work. This is part of a broader book project funded by Azim Premji University in Bangalore. Here, we illustrate how body politics and the politics of technology compound one another for female sex workers in Bangalore in their experiences of three technologies: mobile phones, CCTV surveillance, and television media. Mobile phones have emerged as an integral part of street-based sex work in Bangalore as a result of female sex workers abstaining from public spaces that have been overwhelmingly eroded due to urban transition and gentrification over the last 2 decades in Bangalore. Simultaneously, intensified CCTV surveillance of the city spaces keep watch on them, while native language television media routinely conducts operations discovering and publicly disseminating information on immorality and delinquency. All three technological experiences have had complicated fallouts for female sex workers, which are a result of the politics of technology that are at the foundations of these experiences. Our main argument here is that the position of female sex workers is complicated not only by the politics of technology, but by the body politics that intersects their technological experiences. This comes about because both politics of technology and body politics share strikingly similar concerns in the territories of self, community, support, resistance, negotiation, commerce, and power among female sex workers. Body politics refers to the systems, structures, institutions, practices, and policies through which powers and discourses in society regulate their body, as well as the struggle over the degree of individual and social control of the body in its economic, agency, and the intimacy aspects. And technological experiences are surely socio-political experiences tightly linked to the crucial undertones of power and other social institutions. Let us take each technology one by one.
The mobile phone creates a surrogate presence of the body of the female sex worker in virtual space, where she's able to effectively solicit, negotiate, and even offer limited forms of service and voyeurism. Operations using mobile phones have gained a special significant validity during the time of writing this paper, when the COVID-19 pandemic was raging in India, with sex workers suffering disproportionately with little or no state or social support. The threat of physical violence on the streets may be diminished, but one's bodily privacy is also seriously compromised. Commodification is intensified when bodies are passed around via the phone, a discomfort exploited by law enforcement, who virtually handcuff the worker and restrain her in the police station simply by holding hostage her phone, an extension of her body. The bodies of the workers are held to ransom, threatening with illicit circulations of images and videos. But female sex workers have also narrated at length how the phone is not only an extension of the hand, but is also an extended ear, voice, and heart. It appears of the device intersect with the politics of the body. An equally anthropomorphic casting of a technological device that exerts control over the body in space and time is with respect to CCTV cameras. As evidenced by law enforcement agents, this surveillance, which is publicly and legally endorsed and legitimized, serves multiple purposes, including the sifting and weeding out of undesirable bodies in the human landscape of the imagined city, motivated at its core by a reconstructed definition of the public itself. This technology has faithfully continued the historical tradition of monitoring the immoral public woman. The outcome is an unwilling and helpless erosion of the ownership of their bodies in space and time. Television media, as a technocultural actor, has become a self-ordained guardian of social morality, weeding out elements such as female sex workers who adulterate social order and the purity of the female body. This new emissary of social morality has given itself the full freedom to identify and victimize those bodies who are not in consonance with the larger definition of legitimate public bodies or urban informal workers. This new techno-cultural force, with its intentions of scanning and scrutinizing threats to morality and public health, curtails the agency of the body in public and private spheres, including invasive and public humiliation tactics. The patriarchy-framed discourse around the definition and the classification of the public woman is regurgitated by TV media, inviting the gaze of the decent citizen to question the moral legitimacy of her very existence and her bodily citizenship. So, on the one hand, the politics of the body, the politics of technology are associated with the body and the being of the sex worker. And on the other hand, body politics becomes a natural component within technological experience because bodies and beings of female sex workers have always been pinned up for socio-political contestation. So, for female sex workers, if technological artifacts are either extensions of one's body or are weapons of reinforcing body power over their bodies, at once the politics of technology domain of body politics, and body politics becomes a concern for the politics of technology. As a site for socio-political and technological experience, and therefore the politics of technology reinforces body politics in novel dimensions. Socio-political experiences and technological experiences find the body as an arena to situate, providing within the body avenues for emancipation as well as avenues for convolutedness. At once, the public and private domains of existence for female sex workers are caught in one pincer grasp as a result of body politics and the politics of technology mirroring into one another. Thank you for listening.
Okay, now stop sharing. All right, so I hope everyone can hear me and everyone is still there. I'd like to start off by thanking all of our panelists for their insightful presentations. Over the course of the next hour, we'll be learning much more about their work. But before we start the discussion, I'd like to quickly reflect on all of the presentations and the research that we've learned about so far. A question that all of the presentations elicited for me was, what is the ambition of the so-called smart city, and who gets to decide what this is? While there's no one universal definition of a smart city, we've seen recurring themes across their different presentations. Green goals manifested in the development of eco-cities or sustainable smart cities, like in Manchester and Sejong. Cities touting improved service provision and convenience to citizens by way of digital investments through re-infrastructuring, as is the case of upgrading streetlights in Vienna, or the installation of smart kiosks in cities like New York or even London. But we also see the deployment of digital infrastructures to control social order, weed out the undesirable or the immoral elements in our cities through investments in surveillance technologies like CCTV networks. Clearly, the datafication of our cities is changing future urban imaginaries. But how does the smart city subvert or pave the way for a new digital democracy? And what does this mean for local governance? We saw that in the city of Sejong, decision makers chose to deploy infrastructures that met their vision of a smart city, but all the citizens didn't subscribe to this notion. In Vienna, streetlights were changed in an ad hoc manner without public consultation, and it turned out to be detrimental for certain populations, like those with visual disabilities. Is the smart city only for a certain type of citizen? On the other hand, new digital infrastructures, like smart kiosks, are providing services that help people. Homeless communities in New York City used links to access shelters and communicate with loved ones, but at what cost? The ambiguity and the role that the private sector plays in this new service provision leaves room for data extraction and discrimination against marginalized groups. It's becoming increasingly clear that we need new frameworks of responsibility to ensure just and equitable transitions to digital governance. But these new frameworks will have to navigate the various scales and the plethora of actors that contribute to the production of the smart cities. Manchester becoming a smart and sustainable city is contingent on actors outside of the city, like policymakers for energy and even rural communities for generation. Drs. Padmanabhan and Kamath discussed that individually owned technologies like mobile phones have enabled female street sex workers to expand their services and potentially even reduce physical harm. However, the technology has also allowed for the exploitation by law enforcement and the commodification of women's bodies by customers. The so-called smart city promotes the idea that access to technology can improve quality of life, but without adequately addressing and examining data asymmetries, power dynamics, and the contesting visions of smart cities at national, subnational, and individual scales. We run the risk of having smart cities mirror or reinforce existing inequalities or creating new data harms. At Transitions Research, I'm leading a Future Cities initiative, and we're looking at how technological transformations are playing out in Indian cities. We're working in the city of Panjim, and we're looking at how technology in provision through private sector or through the public sector is changing people's lives. How is e-governance shaping provision of services? Who is being left out? We're working with a company called Safety Pin to look at how the built environment and how technology can be used to actually evaluate women's safety. So technology has a huge role to play in the development of our cities across the world. But the question is how do we make sure that this is responsible, equal, and just? With these remarks and reflections, I'm excited to pass the mic on to Dr. Vikram Mathur, the session chair. Thank you very much, and I really enjoyed all the presentations, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Vikram, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Thank you very much. So I really enjoyed all the presentations, and I don't want to talk more much, but I just want to give, to start off the conversation. I see we don't. I mean, either I can't see all the audience, or we don't have a very large group of audience. Either of those two things could be true. But I'm going to set up the discussion by just posing, drawing on some of the remarks that Ashali's made, and posing three questions, three sets of questions to the panelists. And I think we can go around kind of to each group and get some, 2 or 3 minutes of reflections on those questions. And then we can see if the panelists want to ask each other any questions or there are any questions from the audience. And the easiest way for me to track those would be if you were to type them into the chat button. So obviously, I think the three questions that in some sense we are preoccupied with, I would say that neither, I don't want to speak for Ashali, but certainly I don't think of myself as an STS scholar. I think of myself more kind of a practitioner in the space of urban planning. So it'd be really good to hear from STS scholars on what they think are, obviously one of the big questions is this idea of frameworks of responsibility. So sometimes, there is a sense almost that the datafication or the digitalization is inevitable, and perhaps it's not inevitable, and we shouldn't buy into that rhetoric. But certainly, as people working on the ground, we are constantly looking at ways in which we can engage with the smart city kind of initiatives to see what are the frameworks of responsibility. How can we across the countries and across regions that you're working on, what are best practices and what are frameworks of responsibility in relation to the smartening of these cities, right? So that's really one major question. The second question very often is about and this is particularly relevant to the cities in the south or in developing cities, or certainly cities in India that we are interested in, is there are large chunks of the city which are kind of informal residents, or people who are marginalized in one or the other, in more than one way, but sizable parts of the city. And how do we think about kind of data collection as also collective action, and are there other examples in which data practices that can actually be used to empower these citizens rather than disempower them? And we certainly, most recently, at Transitions Research, we looked at it in the context of platform workers and others in a kind of post-COVID scenario. So what are ways in which people can actually use that data to ask the city for access and services, right? So that's another question that's interesting for us. And then finally, underlying our main kind of preoccupation with this panel was what are the emerging power dynamics around the governance of smart cities, and how are existing hierarchies being reproduced or exasperated or mitigated in some ways, and particularly in relation to the role of public institutions, the private sector, and the urban residents, right? So I think those are I would say, three sets of questions that I'm interested in, and I would like to hear from the panelists. And if I've waffled a little bit as I've articulated them, I'll just say, okay, one around the power dynamics in the city and how that is changing, and particularly in relation to public institutions and private sector and residents. The second question around frameworks of responsibility, and the third question around just the agency and participation of marginal groups in relation to data practices and data cultures in these cities. Yeah, and maybe we could go in the order in which the presentations happen. Maybe we could start with Puya and follow the order of the presentations for the panelists to respond and reflect on some of these questions.
I would be more than happy to start. Yeah, I should also say thanks for the organizers and very interesting papers that we heard all. I also see a lot of actually overlaps and a lot of interesting discussions that can be exchanged and can be learned from each one of the contributions. And I will try to reflect on some of the kind of questions posed. And then hopefully we can pick up our discussions afterwards. From the governance point of view, I think it was quite clear to see within many of these kind of examples that we saw today, there are, we shouldn't first take kind of this idea of a smart or sustainability or even a city as for granted. There are multiple ways and there are multiple kind of practices that are embedded in each one of these examples. And if you look at different cities, then we can see this kind of local specificities that actually makes it interesting. And that's exactly comes in against this idea of smart cities, which was initially imposed by private sector, right? So private sector, early studies around smart cities point to that, how corporate kind of identity or corporate narratives is imposed on this. So smart cities are perhaps best known as kind of neoliberalizations or the space that private sector enters. So in the case of Link NYC, this was quite evident. I think that essentially brings the question of city governance and whether we can see, for example, Wi-Fi or access to internet as a fundamental right or not. So this would be my question actually to Justin, and I would like to hear her remarks on it, right? So why don't we see internet as a right to infrastructure? Why? Because a fundamental problem here is when we actually give this agents or give this power or dedicate it to the private sector, and then the privacy question comes in, whereas it can be looked at it as an infrastructure. Why cities don't provide public Wi-Fi to everyone? For example, in the case of Vienna, it's a socialist governed city. Socialist government been around for more than 100 years. We have it. We have it already, but very limited. Perhaps not as advanced as Link NYC, I would say, right? So there are spots that you can get access to Wi-Fi, but it doesn't look as good or advanced as Link. So you see, so these are different aspects. But what is important, and I'm going to stop after this, is first to question who are imagined as citizens here. Again, in the case of Link NYC, it's interesting to think through it. So who were the users who were imagined, right? So I would like to know if Justin could ask the designer of this technology about who they thought they're going to use it, because it is evident to me these are people without cellular data. So therefore, you would, what else would you expect? And then in practice, when something else comes up, it becomes very interesting to actually look at it, how people adjust, and then how actually the public kind of turns it to a different thing. So what I'm trying to say here is there's always a gap between how things are imagined and how things are actually practiced. And this is where STS has a long tradition to enter and actually look at exactly this practice. So smart city in practice and as actually happening. And of course, then we can think about different framing, different frameworks, ethical questions as well as political questions, and STS also has good traditions. So we know about RRA, and there was increasing interest in taking responsibility, recession innovation, responsible recession innovation into account. But there are also some good works around ethics of invention. So Sheila Jazanov is one of the kind of key scholars in that regard. Yeah, I think I should stop here now.
Okay, I don't know if Vikram, are you still there? Right. Maybe while we wait for Vikram to join back, Puya, thank you for your comments. Maybe we can move on to Justine and then.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
I had muted myself. I'm sorry, but yeah, let's move on to Justine.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I could hear you. I can hear you.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Ah, good, yep. Okay, look, I'll do my best here. It's pretty late here in Australia, just hit 12 o'clock, midnight. So wonderful to be with you all, even if it is pretty late, and wonderful to see you all as well, you know, having corresponded via email over the last couple of months. And I really enjoyed this panel. I think it's a really great collection of papers and videos on different aspects of the smart city, and I really like the focus on you know, what you might call the global South smart city experience as well, and looking at how that experience might articulate with populations in the global North. I always find that term a little bit confusing, being sort of in the global South myself. But then again, we're down under, so everything's a bit topsy-turvy down here. But yeah, I really like some of those resonances between the sort of marginalized public's experiences of smart cities in the global North that you know, might be conceived of as minority communities to some extent. Although, you know, that if we're talking about gig workers and young people, they're not so much minorities compared to, say, you know, quite substantial sections of the population who might also be marginalized in other cities, urban cities in the global South. As Vikram mentioned, that can actually be quite a substantial population, you know, in its own right. So you've got these sort of interesting sort of power asymmetries being played out just across the sort of different national contexts in relation to what kind of power marginalized groups might potentially have within smart cities, which I think is I'm still sort of trying to think that through, but it seemed to come through really strongly across these papers. Another thing that you know, I love sort of is it Puya's work on algorithms, working off Lefebvre's rhythm analysis, and I'd love to know more about that and how we can sort of think about the sort of temporalities of smart cities, which I feel like sometimes we neglect. I certainly do. It becomes a sort of a secondary focus when spatialities seem to really take over when we're thinking about smart cities, and maybe that's something that a lot of the, I guess, is so very dominant in a lot of the corporate narratives as well. So I love the potential of being able to draw out those temporalities. And I keep on thinking about the, I don't know if you have this in Vienna, but all of the traffic pedestrian crossings have a sound that accompanies the crossing when you are able to cross. The sort of and it sort of sounds different in every country, I've noticed. And there's a kind of a familiarization that you need to do when you travel to a different city that operates at that level of the audio level, but also the speed and frequency of those crossings, you know, that kind of drives people to get across as quickly as possible. Otherwise, they're going to get run over at a major intersection. And what that speed, you know, the frequency of those is actually doing is really interesting. So these sort of temporalities, I kept on thinking about them. I loved your paper. And Joelle, I really liked yours too. And I know we've spoken virtually before, but it was really pleasing to see where your research, how it evolved. And I can see a lot of parallels between your research and your finding, particularly in relation to the disconnect between the sort of everyday experiences and imaginaries of what the smart city is. And even this idea that maybe, you know, that then people don't think about their city as smart at all necessarily. And that, but they might still sort of see that as a future projection or something that they might, that their city might become. But there is this really clear disconnect, and that really resonated with my research as well. When we were talking I didn't talk a lot about my research in London and Glasgow, but in Glasgow we studied InLink UK, which is effectively exactly the same smart kiosk system that New York City has with the links they're sort of commonly known as. But in Glasgow, when we were talking to members of the public in the street, we spoke to them, and they had these really wonderful ideas about what these inlinks could actually be. And what was really interesting is that the vast majority of the public hadn't even noticed them until we drew them to their attention by asking them what they thought they were. They hadn't even seen them because effectively they're just large, they see them as large advertising billboards. And urban citizens have become so good at filtering out large advertising displays that they were just part of the kind of landscape that they, you know, that they moved around and navigated around to get to where they're actually trying to go. So when we asked them, what do you think these things are? They said, oh, is it a metallic tree? Does it read your heartbeat? Will it save someone from a heart attack? You know, all these amazing imaginaries and fantastic ideas about what these links could possibly be. You know, has it just landed out of space? I mean, it was really interesting because it was like they'd seen them for the first time. So you do get this really interesting disconnect, I think, between smart city imaginaries, corporate imaginaries, and yeah, just to sort of talk about what you were saying, Puya, in New York City and also in London and Glasgow, and I'll just finish off on this point. You know, the corporates see the manufacturers and the councils that often come together to roll out these sorts of initiatives and these sorts of networks. They see the work that the users, the primary users of these, as being, you know, well-heeled, well-connected professionals, young people, but you know, they only imagine that they're going to use them for short periods of time, for sort of short gaps in their ubiquitous connectivity that they already have through their mobile phones. And they certainly don't imagine that they're going to be used for long-term use, which is really what happened, what was identified as problematic usage in New York City when it was rolled out in 2016 and became sort of problematized around its use by populations of people who were experiencing homelessness and rough sleepers, because they were using it for long periods of time because they didn't have a home to go to access comfortably the internet and experience technology in any other way. So I think there are all these sorts of interesting disconnects, and they do really come back to issues of spatiality and temporality and access to resources in all sorts of different contexts. But I'm just going to leave it there because I'd like to hear from others, of course. And I know, Vikram, I didn't really talk very much about frameworks of responsibility, but I do agree with you entirely that this is really important. And the issue of, should public Wi-Fi be free? Well, public Wi-Fi, of course it should be. Many people have argued it should be a free infrastructure, but I think what it comes down to is that even many city councils would agree with that. But they sort of make these sorts of compromises in terms of how they think they're going to be able to deliver a city-wide infrastructure like that, because it's a very expensive infrastructure and not necessarily the best really way to address some of the kind of long-term connectivity needs of residents that might not have really quality internet access at home. For example, if you're in public housing in New York City, 1/3 of the city does not have broadband access at home. They're accessing the internet through, mobile dongles and mobile phones, and really, really quite poor in all sorts of ways kind of internet access. So these sorts of issues come to the fore. But then I think they think that yes, Wi-Fi should be free, but how do we pay for such an infrastructure? And so certain sorts of compromises are made, and that's where you get these public-private infrastructure partnerships.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Vikram.
Thanks. I'm going to move on to Tariq, and Tariq, better.
Yeah, can you hear me? Is that coming through?
Yeah.
Good. I had some problems with the internet. I dropped off for a minute, so apologize if I repeat anything. Yeah, thanks for organising the session. I'd echo the the others in saying it was really interesting. I've got a lot. I'll try and digest some of my notes into some sort of coherence if I can. I think to just go to the sort of questions that you've asked, Vikram, about sort of frameworks of responsibility. I think that they're really important to ask. But I suppose one of the things I've been thinking about for quite a while is how do we even figure out who can and who can't act, and that comes back to, I think, to sort of key ideas in STS to do with distributed agency. And I think that there's what's really nice about all of the presentations here is that they're pointing to how it is that agency is distributed in reference to different technologies and practices, and that actually to rethink frameworks of responsibility, it's crucial to actually understand how it is that technologies are designed, how they're deployed, and also how they're engaged with. And that leads me to another sort of term or word that I have that I wouldn't say irritates me, but I always think about it. There's this sort of the amorphous entity of the citizen that we'll speak about and mention sort of whether or not that's the use of that term is as useful as maybe us or researchers thinking about actually practitioners, because I think what we found in a lot of the work is we're talking about different groups of practitioners and instances and how they interact with technologies and the types of sort of design of technologies for particular sets of practices. And I think there's something really interesting there, typical sort of early STS work, Ackrich, about the scripting and descripting of technologies in particular contexts, and how studying that is a great means of sort of unpacking or seeing this distributed agency, and then being able to shift to think about frameworks of responsibility in reference to particular practices, be that to do with access to key services, what should and shouldn't be seen as essential services, or discussions, say, of sort of what we need to do to get to sort of zero carbon cities or wider and stuff like that. So I suppose my thought would be to flip the sort of the question of responsibility for me is to think firstly about distributed agency. And then the other thing I think that was really interesting from all of the talk, to what extent we are actually talking about smart cities, or we're talking about different forms of technologies and practices, but also crucially about infrastructure. And this is something that's sort of key in my work, and I was thinking about. I was interested in the sort of social infrastructure that's coming through in many of these sort of cases. I would include there, say, policing and stuff like that, and the sort of connections between infrastructures, be those sort of typically defined sort of socio-technical systems, as classic work to do with electricity or transport, but also, like I said, these sort of social infrastructures, which are again really defined by service provision and the intersection between those in cities. And then the only other thing, I suppose, I think you mentioned, I think, about one of the questions about asking the city for access to services or something along those lines. It's how much, what do we mean by the city there? Because we're sort of personifying the city as a thing of it, and this comes, I suppose, back to this. What are our objects of inquiry, our units of investigation, and to what extent actually the city. What role does the use of the city play here? What maybe it clouds in some ways what we're actually talking about, which is maybe an intersection and development of different technological innovations, and a sort of contestation between designers and users, policymakers, and that type of stuff. So I'll stop waffling there, but hopefully make that some semblance of sense anyway. But yeah, I'd like to say thanks once more for organising. It was really, really useful.
Rebecca, you want to add to that?
A little bit
Rebecca?
to that. Yep, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. They're really interesting and a really interesting discussion. I noted down one of the first kind of points that came out of the discussion, and that was that we shouldn't take the smart, sustainable city for granted. And I think that's something that's really coming out across the presentations, is the different ways we're looking at these different aspects of the smart city and how the smart city is being kind of governed and organised. And I guess that's where we have taken a slightly different approach in our chapter, where we're looking beyond the city boundaries to try and see how the decisions that we're making in the smart city are actually impacting those kind of rural residents who may be having to live right next to the energy infrastructure that's powering the city. And also, we kind of were thinking about kind of the idea of we're thinking about like data being able to use to empower citizens. We've been thinking about that from an energy perspective. So if citizens in the city kind of knew where their energy was coming from and where it was being produced, would that change how they were kind of engaging with energy and kind of using the city? So I'll leave it there for now, but really interesting presentations. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Over to Joanne.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So thank you, everyone. It was really interesting presentations. And I really enjoyed having all of those different scenarios and imaginations of smart city in different parts of the world presented. So it was really, really interesting. And in my case, I might be a little brief, but like most of the things which I thought was interesting, and how much discussion there is actually between the practitioners, as just Torik said, and the one which actually are making the decisions. How much do we need that, and how willing those decision makers could be about interacting with those people? And I think another aspect which I was interested in the different presentation was how much private actors could play in a role. We saw that in a few of these presentations, but I sometimes had a little trouble to understand how much in each of your of your presentation how much the role of private actors was important. Very, very pointed question to Puya, which was, how much do you think the algorithmic and the algorithm of the streetlights actually impacted citizens' decision into moving into space? That was kind of what I was curious about. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Over to Neeti and Anand.
I hope you can hear us now, right? So thank you for such interesting, wonderful presentations and such an insightful discussion of all these papers, So as you must have already noticed, the pitch at which, we actually address this issue of technology and it's a kind of a conversation with this kind of different from the earlier presentations, because the broader theme of this work, in fact, the part is the presentation broader and its impact on one of the section of workers, that is street-based sex workers. And so when we have started our study in that way, we were actually at that point, we were not focusing mainly on technology. So only much later, during our 3 years of field work, one thing which we were kind of recurring theme was this thing of using of mobile phones and the CCTV cameras and how does it actually affecting the life and work of a highly informal section of. That's where that we are listening to that we kind of looking at this aspect of technology in their everyday life and work. And one thing which we could see is that's a part of urban transition and gentrification process, which going here is how to make the city safe and how to kind of avoid some of this dangerous elements from the most sanitized city. So that's where we are actually looking at this whole narrative of technology. Yeah.
So India has always been put forward sort of a lodestar of the technological city and so on. And like Neeti had just said, our idea was actually not to look at any of that, but to look at an ethnography of street-based sex workers. They're the ones who told us about these technological experiences. We didn't have actually this objective when we spoke to them. So, and that it came entirely from their side. Leaving aside mobile phones and CCTV cameras, in fact, the most important thing that came from them was this new actor of the television media. Almost what shall I say, unconsciously agenda of the right kind of citizen in the smart city. It was never on the agenda of the policymakers to open the media, and especially the native language media, not the English news media, but the native language media to do this. And they did it almost with graphical, what spectacular graphics and things like that to show what kind of people we don't want in our city. And that added to the entire idea of what kind of people do we need in our smart city. So you had a narrative of smart cities going on at all levels of government, including right up to. And these people, these agents, very happily harping on, this sort of, what should I say, a very informally the kinds of people we want. So, spoke to police personnel and about what kind of system they want. And they had no answer, but they had very precise answers about what kind of people they don't want. So it was I just to put a long story short, I think the smart city in this context was about a process of elimination, a very clear, and job of that. And there are no laws currently and no regulations currently in place to check these things. So I guess one of the things that we can contribute even to Ashali's question right here is that one of a greater accountability of malpractice in smart city. I think that just how do we improve this process? And I think a certain is necessary from the part most marginalized. So that's
and also about who's actually citizen when you think about this whole urban transition or smart cities, then as Anand had rightly mentioned, when our discussions with urban or our discussions with the and persons, one thing which we can is that we want to make sure that the city, they shouldn't have any unnecessary elements, so that we could clearly see that there is a classification, and when we think about which is there is a kind of saving or supporting the citizens in the city, but at the same about what about these marginalized people? Something I'm missing. So that's what we were trying to do, a kind of a counter narrative of urban transition.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. I mean, we have 10 more minutes and we have a few questions. I know, Pooya, there were a few questions that were directed to you by the other panelists. Do you want to try and tackle them? And I see that Tariq has also asked you about the kind of utopian narratives in your case. So maybe over to you. We have one comment from the audience. It's further to private actors, the Cisco exec in a talk once referred to citizen censors, citizens and agents of Cisco via their devices. Regulation, yes. Okay, so Pooya, you want to take some of the questions that were directed to you, and then I don't know how to, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Maybe I start by Joel's actually comment. So basically what I did in this research was, as I said, I tried to really do some sort of ethnographic work, going on the street and really trying to find where are the algorithms. I was in this very kind of sociology of mundane, exactly about delegations and inscription and script, like taking Actwich as a point of departure, but also I was influenced by Lefebvre, so I came up with this idea of algorithm. And in fact, what happened was when I walked on the street, the first kind of junction that I ended up, and then one thing about capturing rhythms is through sound and noise, right? So what happens is exactly what Justin referred to. So that's that very beat, boop 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 boop, for the blind. That captured me, and then I started to looking at the traffic light in a completely new light, right? So then I found an object to follow. And through that object, I started to looking into means of control, and then how is this delicated, and then how is this kind of idea script can actually help us to understand how we employ algorithms in everyday life, right? So very mundane object, very mundane practice, and then I go after the designers of this technology. So I conduct interviews and lab observations with computer scientists who develop these algorithms. So I look into how these algorithms come and what does it mean and what does it do. And then what happens as I go through, it becomes evident it's a political question. Going back to Wiener's work, objects have politics, and then it is clear about who imagines who and who delegates what agency to it. So it's not distributed agencies, it's the distribution that is the most problem, I would say, right? And if I want to kind of contribute a little bit to the main questions of the panel. So in SDS, we have influences from American pragmatism, and particularly John Dewey. So there, the suggestion is we have to look at how the issues is framed, which is going to inform what and how solutions going to come up. And I think it's the entry point. is the entry point. This is, for example, something I would have asked Rebecca and Torek about. Like, I couldn't really grasp what is at stake. Like, what is this issue? Like, and then if you want to follow sociology of translation, and then it's exactly about how the issue is framed and then how solutions are negotiated among different actors, right? So that probably, if I wanted to have a conversation about this project, which I find it very interesting because it relates to infrastructural actually lives and this invisible kind of effect of infrastructure in supposedly this kind of smart city, which comes back to his comment about this kind of the idea of a narrative, right? And then it's like how utopian it is. In case of Vienna, at least I can tell you, Vienna is very careful. So Vienna is one of these case studies. I would recommend it as like kind of how a city goes like very carefully. It's like very careful about including the private sector. So even these algorithms were developed by University of Graz, for example. So they don't employ private sector, but they go for like academics, for example. But because of this ideology behind it, being supposedly a socialist government, which there are, but then at the same time also observe how through smartification it becomes more and more a neoliberal city, right? So there's also some other aspects embedded into it. Yeah, and perhaps if I want to just go back to Joel, I think as Justin also mentioned, and for me it was important to think about temporalities, and particularly when it comes to behavior. So you ask about how citizen behavior kind of were affected. Not so much, but what happened that very box to push the button was kind of put out. That was the initial idea. So that was an issue. They frame it as an issue, and they designed the system to tackle that issue. They took that box out, and then when you take the box out, then you take the bit out for the blind people, right? So then the way the issue was framed, because it didn't include particular groups or particular needs, then the design led to a failure. And then all the money that was put in there also went to failure, right? But behavior also kind of needs time. And I think in your case, what is important is exactly to think about agency of time, because this nudging that is very, very, famous now in the smart cities. I think if you look at it in the long term, then I think it will have effect. And I'm still struggling how to, especially in A&T sense, how to bring time as an agency or temporalities into account.
Great. Any other comments or reflections? And then I'm going to start closing up this discussion. We have about 4 or 5 minutes more, 6 minutes maybe. Okay, great. So, I mean, my job, I'm just going to say thanks to everybody for being part of the panel. I know Ashali had a few parting thoughts on this, but definitely, I mean, from our end, please stay in touch, and if you're ever in Goa and want to interact with us or whatever, just I would love to hear from you guys. So yeah, Ashali, over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much. Yeah, again, I'd like to reiterate Vikram's comment. Thank you to everyone for your really insightful presentations and the effort in helping putting this panel together. I'd just like to think about some of the themes that were discussed today in the context, maybe if you don't mind selfishly, from the work that we're doing as transitions research, as we think about smart cities in India. And I think what's one thing that's interesting is that a lot of the projects and a lot of the work that you've been discussing, it seems to be the city itself coming up with the ideas, or cities themselves working with, the private sector in some way. But in India, one thing that's really interesting is the idea of the smart city being conceived at the national level. Right? It was conceived in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, and it's been kind of more of a top-down process, which is why I think I asked my question about citizen participation and governance in smart cities. But I think as we've talked about marginalized groups, as we've talked about the role of the private sector, we've talked about governance, there have been a lot of really interesting ideas that have come up. And I think that, new governance frameworks are definitely required. We can't just continue to allow, all the different actors that play a role, especially the private sector, to come in without any kind of accountability and governance, the public sector and local governments that do benefit in some ways, by relying and working with private sector partners to provide certain services, take the case of maybe free Wi-Fi, do need to have some checks and balances. And I think that's the same lesson that can be applied to many Indian cities, where Cisco itself also is one of the main companies that's coming in, and deploying a lot of these sensors in the cities. But who are they sensing? What are they sensing? How are they sensing? None of that is really public knowledge. None of that is really being thought through from a lens of inclusion, equity, or even privacy. So yeah, those are just a couple of thoughts that I had to wrap up. I'd really like to thank everyone for their time, their effort with the presentations, and I look forward to staying in touch. And for everyone, I hope it's okay. The presentations were recorded, so they'll be available on the program page. I think probably by tomorrow, well, India time tomorrow, probably in a few hours, in the rest of the world. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Oh, and I really appreciate everyone staying late, especially you, Justine. It's really late for you. Thank you so much.